Hello, my name is Megan Varner. I am a health coach with a background as a physical therapist, helping those with POTS and chronic fatigue rebuild their energy so that they can thrive again in their lives. I myself am very passionate about helping this group of individuals as I myself have lived with both of these conditions along with a connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome over the last decade, or knowing I had them, I should say, over the last decade. And I am very much in the mindset that there is hope and a path to take to begin to get back to the life that you have before these conditions began to change your life. So today's video is going to be about navigating POTS flares. Flares can happen, and I am a firm believer that every flare that happens can teach us something. I like to remind my clients of that, to not get stuck in a state of frustration and defeat. However, there are some key factors that you can recognize to help pull yourself out of a flare or potentially prevent a flare down the road, and steps that you can begin to intentionally start putting into motion to either prevent the flare or reverse the flare when it happens. I do want to say that a big piece of navigating flares is mindset. This may sound a little bit cheesy. I definitely would have thought this maybe a decade ago if someone, when I first got diagnosed, told me this, but what we think directly impacts the chemicals that are released into our body. And the state of our mind affecting these chemicals can either shift us into more of a state of fight, flight, or freeze, in which we can have more difficulty getting out of a flare, or can actually contribute to leaning into a flare. Worry and fear can release stress hormones, and that can put us more into a sympathetic state, which for those of us with POTS, we already tend to get stuck in this sympathetic fight or flight state with higher levels of cortisol and adrenaline circulating through our system, elevating our heart rate and causing us to crash and burn. So that said, there are some key other factors that you can get in tune to help prevent or navigate through a flare, and intentional steps that you can take to get yourself out of a flare and reverse the trend. So, two things to recognize that I have found super helpful in my own journey, and I guide clients to tap into when we start working together, is recognize your patterns and your triggers. What do I mean by this? This is where having some objective insight, either from a person or from some type of wearable device, can give you a ton of information to see patterns that are leading up to your flares. And believe it or not, there are patterns. Some of these things can be a bit out of our control that affect these patterns, but most of the time there's a good 50% or more that we can begin to flesh out. So asking someone that can give you an objective opinion, possibly a medical provider in your life that's been with you for a while, a friend, a family member, a spouse, to help you remember maybe some things that preceded some of your last few flares, like an increased stress load, a change in your sleep schedule, a change in your work schedule, some major life event, an illness, a change in your diet, a change in your weight, something along those lines, just to get your mind thinking in that direction. Something that has been super helpful, and I actually include as part of my coaching program, is using the information, like I mentioned, from a wearable device of heart rate variability, or HRV, combined with heart rate data trends. Heart rate variability is a measure of how well our parasympathetic nervous system is functioning. And those of us with POTS, we have some parasympathetic nervous system dysfunction. It's not firing as well, pushing on that brake, and we're pushing on the fight or flight gas pedal often. So our HRV can tend to be lower in general. However, when we start seeing HRV trends drop, that can be a sign that we're going into a flare for some of the reasons I mentioned a few seconds ago. Also, kind of on the opposite of that, are heart rate trends. Heart rate typically begins to trend higher when we are more stressed out or our body has a higher mental or physical load of stress, depending upon what we are exposed to. You can answer that question for yourself. But for instance, if you have a normal resting heart rate overnight in the 60s and it starts to trend into the upper 60s or 70s, that can be a sign that your body is going into a more stressed state. So looking at these two trends kind of in a 2 to 3 day time frame, or even over a week's time frame for some, can be helpful to see if a flare is possibly in the near future. The other piece to recognize is, what are your triggers? A common exercise I give clients when we first start working together is to make a list of things that are draining their energy. Energy drainers can also be termed as triggers. This could be extensive increase in your workloads, a lot more social interaction, a lot more standing, the amount of physical exercise you do going drastically up or even drastically down. Exercise is a big piece of managing POTS, so you just have to find your sweet spot. Something else I talk to clients about in my program. Even changes in your diet, changes in your environment, as many of those with POTS that I've encountered, including myself, have triggers that can initiate some type of mast cell activation. That can also be reflected in your HRV and your heart rate numbers. So find your pattern and figure out your triggers. So once you know those, you can then start taking intentional steps to reverse the downward spiral where you feel like you're circling the drain of a flare. Or if you do find yourself in a flare, you'll know the steps to help get yourself up out of that flare. Knowing these intentional steps that are all unique to each one of us, but there are some common themes, can really begin to give you back that power and not feel defeated and powerless when the flare is coming or has happened. So, some steps that you can take that are pretty globally helpful from both my own experience and having worked with quite a few clients at this time is looking at your nutrition. Has something changed? Have you had more or less of something? Common low-hanging fruit is eating regular meals that include a good balance of protein, fats, and carbohydrates, and checking in to see if your fluid intake, including your electrolyte intake, has changed, or if you're having more caffeine or other things like alcohol that are causing you to lose fluid. Reversing that trend that you find yourself going into and going back to the diet that you know that makes you feel better on can do so much for making you not push yourself further into a flare. I've already mentioned mindset, but do want to bring that up again. The mindset that you find yourself in can contribute to pulling yourself down into a spiral of lower energy. So doing things to reverse that, I'll mention some practices in a minute, can be very helpful to reverse the flare direction. Looking at exercise, which I also mentioned before, but getting back into the habit that you were used to and being gentle with yourself if you are in a flare to gradually build back up to where you were before. And being mindful of what's going on with your relationships. These are things like work, school, friends. If something has drastically changed or some large event related to your relationships has happened, that can be something that can be a trigger, but you can also reverse that and look at the flip side of this. What particular relationships in your life can be supportive and help you pull yourself out of a flare, asking for more help, asking for more time, or even just venting your feelings to get your nervous system back on track from being in an angry or fearful or overwhelmed state. Taking steps to get back onto a regular schedule can be extremely helpful to reverse a flare, along with taking more mindful rest breaks throughout the day and integrating more self-care. And on the note of self-care, that can look like anything. A good night's sleep, a good meal can be self-care. An Epsom salts bath can be a self-care. I like to consider somatic practices a form of self-care. Many somatic practices can also help calm the autonomic nervous system. I shared some on my prior video about how to manage adrenaline surges with POTS, if you'd like to check some of those out. Vagus nerve massages and any particular positions that you can put your body in to signal a state of safety can all be very helpful. So I hope sharing how to navigate flares, reverse the trend, and potentially prevent further flares have been helpful. Remember, it is very much possible to figure out your patterns, your triggers, and begin to implement intentional steps so that you have fewer flares and feel more empowered to rebuild your energy and get back to thriving in your life. And if you're interested in having more personalized support to walk through the steps of identifying your patterns, even using objective data from a wearable device, and finding out your triggers and the personal steps that help you to thrive the most, reach out either by dropping a message below this video or sending me a quick email at megan.varner@guidetoresilience.com. Until next time, take care of yourself.